Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining. Our fourth quarter client webinar of 2021 has been a very interesting another year for us. So all of you that are part of the call, whether you're securities, whether you're facilities or the mail center team, you've remained essential services to all of your organization. And we really do understand here at RaySecure that you guys have been doing more with less, right? And so changing of procedures and COVID has just changed just the landscape for all of us. So what we wanted to do here at RaySecure is to help you with everything mail security. So to wrap up the year, we have William Plummer, that is going to our CSO, that's going to be sharing with us this last part of this webinar series on high profile incidences and emerging threats. So this presentation is intended to share with your team as well. So if your teammates cannot partake in this presentation, it is recorded and it will be available on our LMS platform. So if any of you have any questions on how to get to that presentation thereafter on our LMS, please reach out to me and be more than happy to help you with that for you to share this content with your team. If you have any questions during the presentations, you can send them directly to me at nelkas@raysecure.com, or please, put them right in the chat here for everybody to see as well. So enjoy the presentation and I will hand it over to Will. Thanks, Will.
All right, hi everybody. So first off, I'm going to start sharing my screen and we're going to kind of go through this. The first thing we did when I wrote this, I was thinking it's December and you're not necessarily have everybody, and you should be able to take this back and go train your team with it. So the slide deck will be available. You can go through and use it as need be, or hopefully help somebody out, try to meet some requirements that you might have. So we're talking about high profile incidents and threats, and because it's 2021 and we're looking at the end of it, we're looking at the statistics, like what happened throughout the year. This year was really interesting, and with it, we saw everything from January 6th all the way down to the mandate of vaccinations within most corporations and companies and the fallout from that. So we'll kind of look at the stats and how it played out. So first things first, the agenda. We're going to go through the numbers pretty quickly. We're not going to spend too much time. Like I said, this is intended for you to be able to take away and train your team with it, so they're there and you can pull from it. Driving factors, growing problem areas, where we've seen clients with having problems or where we've seen incidents that have come up, and that's a good high profile set of examples for 2021 to help you use them for learning tools and teaching effect. So the driving factors that pulled most of the incidents in 2021 generally fell under these four categories. There were some other outliers, but these are the ones that came up and affected companies and corporations the most. The beginning part of it, mistrust in media and the government, that's proven through everything. I mean, if you look at the news, you see one side yelling at the other side, and that unfortunately is the reality we live in. Continued COVID response stints. We've seen the new variant that came out, and it's starting to shut people back down again, and countries are shutting their borders. And with that, you're seeing a lot of protests, and you're seeing a lot of violence is coming out of it. Mandatory vaccine policies, this is starting to affect a lot of companies and corporations. We have several clients that have decided that, for example, you haven't got your vaccination by 1 January, well, you're no longer an employee. At that point, you've been working remotely, you've got a laptop and a phone, we're going to send you a box that says, you pack everything in it, ship it back to us, you no longer work for us. What's going to come back in that box is always suspect. And then a lot of it also comes back to feeling a lack of representation, and that we'll see on some of the stats for let's say it's racial violence and that type of problem. So the problem areas that we saw through the numbers, locations, corporate, that increased this year. Headquarters are seeing a lot of issues because people are upset at how they're either handling policies or how they're handling their employees. The government jumped by like 60%. A lot of federal judges, I'll show you the breakdown of these, but that's becoming significant. The trigger topics, obviously we'll talk about COVID quite a few times. That's kind of running the mainstream that we all unfortunately have to live with nowadays. But with that, personal biases and firing and layoffs have been a big response for threat letters, extortion events, and people sending in white powder threats. It's been one of the driving factors behind it. Emerging threats that we've seen is white powder toxicity throughout the years increased. So last year or year before, you might expect that it was going to be flour, sugar, or something along those lines. But now people are saying things like caustic soda. White powder threats that generally were sent, like I said, that were benign, are even something as simple as putting wasabi powder inside of it so that you get a physical reaction, but it's not something that's going to cause a really large charge when the police ultimately figure out who did it. Death threats and hate crime have gone up exponentially. Everything from historically minority museums who have received 10, 15, 20 hate letters. Well, now they're naming names and now they're actively going at the leadership. Hospitals and other forms of what we call regular government or part of society are all being targeted. It's not really used to seeing that. So there's a big uptick in people who don't necessarily feel they're being represented or feel they've been slighted, and they're using mail to get part of their frustrations out. With that, you always have to think about a little bit of escalation. So people make comments online and they don't get a response, and then they will escalate to sending in hate mail or whatever. That is part of an escalation process and things that you should really pay attention to, especially in the mailroom. Just because it's a piece of mail or something that's sent in doesn't mean it should be ignored, and it definitely should be followed up and cataloged. The assessment for the next year, white powder threats are going to continue increasing. In the last year, we've seen Dr. Anthony Fauci got some at the beginning of the year. He had a great quote. I mean, it's not great, but it's the reality. He says, if it's anthrax, I take 30 days of Cipro, I'm okay. If it's ricin, I'm dead. And then you saw the Republican Party for Arizona, because they're contesting the election, white powder threat. And then 2 weeks later, Rand Paul. 3 weeks ago, Representative Omar. All these are government responsible or government entities, but they all were also mail that was screened in some sort of federal protective services requirement, and they were all still delivered to the home or the home office. The midterms are coming, and after last year, you can expect that that's going to be something of a contentious point. We've had several clients that we've talked to that they realize their CEOs and their companies kind of stand for some part, either left or right, and they're expecting something to show up because of it. So that's a viable threat stream you need to take a look at. Higher profile targeting, as everybody went home, it was, historically we're going to send something to the CEO at the office. Well, now everybody works from home, or they at least have been doing it for the last 18 to 24 months. And with that, people know where high profile individuals live. And that's where most of the threats, for example, against the government showed up. They were in homes, not at their office and not on Capitol Hill. And another one that's come up significantly this year has been a drug increase. And we see that growing. So drug dealers don't stand on street corners. You might have heard me say that before. But if you can mail it, there's some form of anonymity. And they say a company with 2,000 people, somebody in there's got a drug problem and their spouse knows. So they're having it shipped to the office. I've had quite a few conversations with clients who've had to say basically, it was once a year we found stuff normally. Well, now it's been 5 or 6 times. And they're having to reset their company's policy on what they do with it, instead of just throwing it away or bringing the employee in. What's your company's stance on it? So that's something that's most likely going to increase in the new year. So in 2021, letters went up a little bit, but they still stayed fairly even between parcel threats and letter threats. These were things that were responded to by first responders, not just everybody goes, that thing looks a little weird. These were events that were actually responded to. The substances, this is what was sent in. If you notice, if you look at last year's numbers, white powder threat was a little lower than this last year. It was like 27%. Threat letters, however, have gone up by it was 18%. Now it's at 25. A couple other things in here. Drugs that were at 9 are now at 18.6, which is significant. And that's not just a little bit. Some of these have been several pounds of illicit material. And the other number that went up is the threat of an IED. Now, there were several devices that were sent this year that were obviously hoaxes, and there were 2 that were legitimately sent. But that number went from 1.7% last year to 2.5%. All these numbers are as of November 25th, and when we do our annual roll-up, you'll get the whole 12 months. We'll send that out as well. But that number is increasing. People are beginning to do things with devices, so pay attention to it. Who's been targeted? The government shot up a lot. Now, I mentioned this kind of a little bit ago, but that is everybody from the January 6th events, and I'll show you a timeline here in a few slides. Once 2 weeks beyond that event, lawyers on both sides, either prosecuting or defending, started seeing stuff. A lot of federal judges and a lot of federal courthouses started being targeted. And then with that, federal judges at their homes. Religious went up a little bit. The other part that's interesting in this is the business side of the house went down, but residents went up. So a lot of that I think that shift is adjustment to where people are physically located. A lot of corporate headquarters just have been empty. So you send your frustrations where the individuals are, and that's the house. Who responded? This isn't necessarily something that a lot of people would glean something from, but 3 points in here that I think really matter. One is hazmat team increase has gone up a little bit. That's critical because if you're putting together emergency action plan or something for your facility, realize that you're probably going to see a hazmat team over some of the other possibilities that will show up. The other thing that went up on this one, and it went up by like 10%, is the amount of times the FBI showed up. That means that a lot of these events crossed a line to where it's now a federal crime and a federal charge compared to last year. They're not taking anything any more seriously. It's the events have just become more serious. So that's either increase in drug, hate crimes that do go to federal levels, and people sending things to federal courthouses. So that's where that number would actually increase. And then the other one that went up again was the bomb squad. So that is people thinking they have a legitimate threat. Now, the bomb squad will show up for a lot of things, and most times when they show up, after the first 20 minutes, they go, "Oh, not mine," and they leave. That's because it's not an IED threat. That number went up because at the end of the day, they still had something that was legitimately looking like a device. So the bomb squad stayed in charge. So that going up is significant as well, just like the number of what the substance actually was. So the year-to-date tracker. This is some of this is what we perceive as what might have caused this, and some of this is just flat reality. So I brought up January 6th several times. It happened, and then if you look about 3 weeks later, you see a spike in events. And primarily they were targeting, like I said, lawyers and judges. That spike goes up. Now there's two anomalies on here. That one big spike in the middle of it, that happened to be somebody in Alabama who dropped off 18 threat letters to churches. So that number is anomalous. But those other rising numbers within that bracket, that's what was primarily being targeted. When the George Floyd trial started and people were having to deal with that before we hit the social protesting summer, again, government and businesses were being targeted. Businesses had a hard time in the February, March timeframe. A lot of them took stances, signs in the front of the building, Black Lives Matter. That drew attention and caused people to start sending them hate mail. So that's where that spike comes from. You can social protests, a lot of political events were hit, and that happened all summer long. We kind of all lived through that through the local news. The next big thing that hit was the federal vaccine mandates. That was out of the White House, and the response primarily went to political and government. People don't believe that the individuals in charge are handling it correctly, and with that, the response was, "I'm going to send something that I want to cause harm to my local leaders." The interesting thing about that, it wasn't necessarily all federal. A lot of state representatives and a lot of government buildings were targeted because they were what the individual sending the threat could see. They maybe don't identify the fact that if you send it to the White House, something will ever happen. But if I send it to my local representative, I'm going to get a response. January 6th findings, that was a big one. That was when they came out and started making this decisions in Congress about what was going to happen. And a lot of that, again, was federal and then back to local government. People feeling that their local representative, who was taking care of them in DC, wasn't doing a very good job, and their response was straightforward. And then we're seeing it now, the corporate mandates for vaccinations. That's becoming something of a mainstay problem. I know every company isn't doing this, but a good majority of them are. And in fact, there's a list that we can send out if you're interested. But you should probably take a look at your company and see what they're doing. You probably already know, but it's something to pay attention to, because if somebody's working from home, that's just a really easy way to send something to them. Highlighted events, a lot of things that were driven were response to cultural or political scenarios. And with that, they're going to repeat. You're going to see these go on and on and on. 2021 was a good year for highlights. I mean, it's a negative comment. This sounds like it's doom and gloom, but it's got a lot of really good examples of things we should watch out for, and we'll go through those events here in a minute. Friction points that are going to require increased screening requirements. Some of these that we've seen are time sensitive. Your company mandates vaccines. That's not going to go on forever, but you might want to make the assessment for the next 90, 120 days, especially if people are working from home and mailing things back to us because they're no longer employees. Everything coming in, there might be suspect. Increased illicit activity through the mail, that's happening more and more, both, like I said, with the threats that are being sent to minorities and sent to particular groups. And then, again, drugs, it's becoming prevalent. And then recurring events that that require continual effort, that's just ongoing daily screening. But again, that's keeping your eye on what's coming on every day. So we've talked about COVID, unfortunately, a lot, and we're going to continue to talk about it because it drives a lot of our lives. But a good example of the year, and this was one of many, was the individual that was just put in prison earlier this week or late last week. 56-year-old man who sent in a hoax bomb threat to a vaccination plant. This was in London and outside of the UK. The reason why this is something that's going to keep coming up is companies all over the world were hit. Canada had a rash this year where treatment facilities, testing facilities, and research facilities were all sent white powder threats because people just don't believe in it. The anti-vaccination group is generally nice people. If they choose not to get vaccinated, it's your own right. You don't have to do anything. But there are people on that side of the world who are on the side of the problem who do feel that they're being infringed upon. And when these things become mandatory, they're going to start doing something about it, unfortunately. I mentioned earlier, but the response to January 6th, this is 3 weeks after the event. Actually, this was just a week later. This was January 16th. Basically, it was a direct response to somebody who was representing an individual who was involved in January 6th. So all of these things we see originally and you go, they're going after the government. This was a lawyer hired privately who was targeted. And unfortunately, this continued throughout the year. So as these next round of events tied to January 6th comes up, which is people getting in front of Congress, people being drugged through, it's not just going to be inside of DC and inside the Capitol. It's going to be where their home bases are and where these people are affected. Because people who took part in that event were from all over the United States. So the event is going to hit everywhere across the country. A large amount of white powder threats went to schools this year. So this is 7 were sent to schools across New York. They're now being acted like the new bomb threat. So you can get somebody outside and get somebody to have to deal with it. And it's not as bad as the laws that will step in if you pull a fire alarm or call it a bomb threat. Those kids get federal charges if it's bad enough. If you watch the news or do any research on what happens when somebody calls it a bomb threat or pulls a fire alarm, it's well mandated in local laws what's going to happen to you. This is oftentimes not covered. So you get the effect of dumping your school for an entire day, and you don't have necessarily the backlash that comes with it. So it continually hit schools this year and other facilities. I'm going to add one more area. A lot of government facilities were hit that were servicing the public. So courthouses were hit, not just for the January 6th stuff, but also because those courthouses, you might have a court date that day and you don't want to go. So place gets emptied out, your court date gets pushed 3 more months, you don't go to jail for 3 more months for your DUI. That's just the matter of fact. The other side of that is DMVs. Everybody who stopped getting requirements to register their vehicle or to go get their license extended, they were automatically done. You have an appointment. I'm going to basically bump my appointment and it's not on me. I don't have to go in for a while. So it happened quite a bit. Politically, the international events this year towards politics were extremely interesting if you worry about threats. Hong Kong in the last 2 weeks has had everything from rancid meat mailed into judges to white powder caustic soda that was sent to lawyers because they're not agreeing with how the government is dealing with China. I mean, that's one small example. This was the president of Tunisia. I mean, we bring these up because politics, I mean, none of us, I looked at the list of who's here, none of us really are dealing with political groups. But the reality is that there is some bleed over for this, and it's something to pay attention to. Not necessarily because the same person is going to send something that would send it to the president of Tunisia is not going to reach out to somebody else, but because if it's seen as working, If it's seen as having an effect and causing change, you can expect that somebody might copycat it and just repeat it. And these end up being quite high profile. And with it, so is the investigation, and so is all the follow-on reporting. So somebody gets a better story of what's going on. Governments, Rand Paul, like I mentioned, he got one. Senator Omar got one 3 weeks ago. The interesting point about this is anybody that thinks that there's a screening process already in place, we know they probably are running on a misnomer. But with that, we assume that the government's covered, and it's not. He's got to his home. Dr. Fauci got to his home. Representative Omar, that was in the home office. It was in the office for the Arizona Republican Party. Screening programs need to be effective and need to be utilized with intent. And even within our own government, a lot of these aren't. So if you have representatives or you have somebody around you, or if you have people that interact with your company that might be on your board or might have something to do with you, it's something to pay attention to. They are actively being targeted. Terrorism threat this year was a little lower compared to last year, but it didn't mean people weren't doing things that were illegal or illicit, and with the intent of hurting a mass group. I mean, ignoring the shootings that are going on, and look what happened in Michigan this week. There's a lot of horrible events, but people are still trying to do something where they could garner attention and possibly hurt a large group of people. This individual was approached by the FBI. He actually has a doctorate, and he said, "I made a mistake. I meant to order one castor bean and one plant," and he ended up ordering 100. They talked to him, go back later and start searching what he was researching, and he was researching how to make ricin. And it was significant. He's now under federal charges and is going to federal jail, but it happened quite a few times throughout the year. So it's often looked at, it's more of an insider threat, and it's something that we should all obviously just pay attention to, but realize it does happen. It's not a one-off. I mentioned in the beginning that there was a huge increase in racial threats this year. This is one example. This is a independent Black museum in Chicago, and they receive threats continually. So it's reality. People do this, and it's unfortunate, but that's what happens. So 1 or 2 a year is their normal number. At this point, I think they're at 14 or 15, and they're not just talking about President Biden or vice president or individuals. They're talking about leadership of the local museum. Prominent, respected individuals who are doing something for their society are being targeted, and it's not just in the office; it's also in their home. And a lot of these people, like I mentioned a second ago, do sit on boards, and they do have a lot of input for corporate America. It's quite public. People do philanthropic things for a reason, and we need to pay attention to who our leadership is and maybe what they're saying in the local news. It's just a matter that we should pay attention to. I mentioned a second ago about the racial increase. This is an example of a specific racial threat, again, going after government, going after leadership. But the reality is that it's often done in combination. So this threat letter was sent in along with several others, but this one was sent in. And then right behind it was a physical attack on their office. And then right behind that was a physical attack on their home. So I mentioned escalation earlier. This is a fantastic example of an escalation process. But the reality is, again, pay attention to your people. If you have somebody that's high profile, there might be more than one threat vector. And you catching something that's coming through the mail and informing others about that threat vector would be helpful. One thing that I do get a kick out of every now and then is when people do things with personal bias or a vendetta, and you feel you don't have any power, so you reach out in any way that you can, and you can delete voicemails, and that's often done. You can ignore emails and quickly delete them, and that's often done. But it's a harder thing when you mail something like this. I'll let you read it, but basically it was feminine products that were sent in that were supposedly used and aimed at an ex-wife. There's a continual set of events like this that happen all the time. I'm going to make a small joke. If you read watch the news. A Florida man is a thing that happens where people just say something crazy, and it usually starts with a Florida man. It also happens with mail, and with that, people look at them as one-offs. But again, escalation, they're probably not. There's other events that have happened that are tied to this, and if things like this pop up, and the ones that we talked about previously, it's not something that should be thrown away. It's something that needs to be cataloged and put in place in some sort of process that your organization might have. One thing that did creep up this year, and we mentioned the things about personal biases and racial threats and drugs, and I mean, you can tell the reasoning for all that. There was a sporadic amount of events for people who just seemed to be frustrated with something in general. This was 3 parcel bombs that were mailed in Germany, and it was to a baby food facility that made baby food, a facility that sold things like Capri Sun, and a facility that sold dry goods, all food related, all significant global headquarters that were targeted, but really there was no combination of reasons except they were all food related. The individual was charged and never gave their reasoning behind it. We actually talked to the company that this was charged, this package detonated at the week that it happened, because they realized they had a mail screening problem at that point when they started finding other packages, other devices. We bring this up because the reality is some of these companies, and obviously not yours if you're here because you have a screening program, some of these companies that you might work with or some that you might interact with don't think they have a problem. All 3 of these organizations said, we just make baby food. Who could possibly be angry at us? Even if you don't perceive yourself as a possible threat or possible target, there's a lot of good in general oversight and in a screening program. It does actually really catch a lot of things like this. The industries that cost us money have been targeted this year as well. So this was an example in California, and it went after an oil refinery site. Very few people there, but they shut down the refinery site for a short period of time. Political activists, individuals who don't like the price of their fuel going up, for example, they have a history of doing this. One thing that we think will act up this year is if you have ever, or you saw when they did the environmental activists, they start building new homes, new tract homes, and people start coming in and drawing and basically terrorizing people who are building them and destroying property. This is starting to increase. So corporate headquarters, yes, but also functional facilities, things that you wouldn't necessarily identify as being a viable target. Well, they shut a refinery down for a short period of time and stopped fuel from being pumped. So it's a new and emerging threat arena that we should all pay attention to. Religious targets were hit a lot this year, and a lot of this was overseas. This was a threat letter with some ammunition that was sent to the Pope, which he's got a fantastic screening program. I'm actually surprised that the information got out, but I mean, that one's kind of expected. The Pope's pretty big, but religious leadership throughout everywhere as small as Myanmar, which religions it's banned there. I mean, it's a very locked down country in the middle of a coup, but their religious leadership was hit all the way across to Italy and France. And then here in the United States, it was primarily Southern churches, primarily Black Southern churches were the ones that were being targeted. We say that. The other side that was hit quite a bit was Asian churches and other areas where people were being targeted in general, and they have historically been minorities, but it's another softer, more, let's say, heartfelt target that they felt that you could reach out and touch. So it happens in our society, it happens everywhere, but it's something, like I said, to pay attention to because it's high profile. Insider threats are increasing significantly, and there's a couple of reasons why. People have been laid off, people have been fired, people don't agree with what their companies are doing, people don't agree with a large, what their company stands for. We have a client that one of their biggest concerns is when we have an event, we almost always get pictures put on social media from inside our corporate headquarters or inside of our facility, because our own employees are taking that picture of a facility being shut down or of some sort of impediment to the day. And when they put those pictures up online, they're speaking personally, but the imagery comes from inside our organization. And some of these were mail threats that showed up. Drugs, for example, this is a fantastic example of something that you wouldn't necessarily think. The paper and the drugs that was attached to it came from the House of Commons in the UK. It came from the second highest organization within the government, and it was mailed to a prisoner. So it's going to get through. It got tested and got caught, but it's going to get through. The insider threats we're seeing here, like I said, are employees who have been laid off. The interesting thing about that is those employees know how to spell the CEO's name properly. They know who inside the facility is most likely a good target to go after. They know how the place works. So if they know your screening criteria, for example, is to ignore interoffice mail and they want to get a threat in, they'll make it look like interoffice mail. They know if you don't look at the returns for the hardware that you happen to sell, they're going to send it back as hardware. So it bypasses your security screening and it gets inside the facility. And oftentimes, like I said, they know how to spell the CEO's name. They also know enough to Google what's going on, and they know how to make sure that what they send you does not appear out of place. So a lot of those things laid back, you need to look at who your problem people are, put them on that list of extra screening on top of the people you're trying to protect. And unfortunately, that might look like some insider threat, folks, as well. Smuggling increased this year. This is fake COVID-19 vaccination cards that were caught at O'Hare. This is the second time they were caught, and they happen all the time. If you watch the news, for example, COVID vaccination cards are highly, they're smuggled quite a bit. But on top of that is anything else that drugs, illicit material. We saw a couple times this year where our clients assumed that something was leaving their facility or their organization through outgoing mail that was proprietary. So it's not just, things as obvious as fake COVID-19 cards, but it might be something insider that you would want to take a look at. The reason for that is simply insider stuff is there's a lot of facilities are still empty and people still work inside, but they have access to other parts of the building they normally wouldn't be able to get their hands on. Smuggling. This is primarily with prisons and jails that I'm intending this slide with. Here's an interesting little side bit. The drugs have always been a problem in prisons. I mean, we can make that assessment. We've all seen TV, we've seen the news, and we can watch TV shows, and it happens all the time. The three main ways that people assume drugs are going in is one, the inmates' visitors. Well, COVID, that we stopped the visitors. Two, guards. If you look at most of the jails and prisons, the numbers that I've heard from people we work with is 25% of those individuals who are prison guards will become inmates or will be charged with smuggling contraband inside of the facility they work in. 20 to 25%. So that's a high number getting in. And the third is mail. Well, a lot of these facilities have stopped allowing prisoners to get mail. Letter will show up. They will photocopy it and give that copy to the prisoner so they don't actually touch anything that comes from the outside. But one thing you can't stop is legal mail. So it's their right to defend themselves constitutionally, and a inmate has every right to talk to their lawyer. But if their brother-in-law, for example, makes something look like it's legal mail, writes Esquire behind their name, and drops in K2 infused paper, fentanyl infused paper, and it gets sent in, that individual then smokes whatever gets sent, overdoses and dies, that brother-in-law can still sue the prison and jail for $1 million because the jail didn't protect the prisoner from that. And there's a lot of uptick in this. And I bring this up because I don't think any of us actually work in jails that's on here today or listening, but the flip side of that is it's working. It gets through. It's already going through a legitimate guard force, and they're getting the drugs through that way. So it's not to say that it won't jump into other parts of our society, and it's effective. Very hard to detect and very hard to trace. So something to think about. Dangerous items, these stay always. This is an x-ray of an actual hand grenade that was sent through the mail and it got to the Capitol in Alaska. Bring this up just because they're continually happening. The last bullet in the first part of this briefing where I said, look, things continually happen. Dangerous items still show up. This was, one of the jokes. You pull the pin for a complaint department, and it's number one, and it's a grenade. But the reality is, people still do things that are dangerous, and it just happens. There's a lot of caustic, flammable material that gets mailed. People don't want to admit what they're putting inside of it, and it shows up on the other end, and it starts smoking in the mailroom. Just something to really keep a finger on and make sure that you're tracking that stuff like this still happens. So that's kind of what we wanted to cover for 2021. I know we set this for 30 minutes and I went a few over. I tried to talk fairly quickly. But again, what we're going to do is send the slide deck to everybody who showed up so you can turn around and train your own people. We'll make it available on the LMS so you can go through it there as well. And then the video we'll post. So you have multiple ways that you can do this if you want to repeat it for your other employees or turn around and give the training yourself, just so you have the stats and it keeps it relevant, realistic, and useful for you. Okay.